Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks very much for this opportunity to tell you about this project. The SCOT2K Pine Dendro project is part of a bigger project going on at the University of St Andrews into the development of native pine dendrochronology in Scotland. And I'd like to just mention some of my collaborators, including Rob Wilson and Cheryl Wood at St Andrews and Anne Crone at AOC, who've all been involved in one way or another in this project. There are quite a few others as well, but I won't go into that just now. So the objectives of SCOT2K were these: to build a network of native pine chronologies to reconstruct the past climate of Scotland, and to facilitate the dating of historic pine structures. And we aim to do this using samples from living trees, from timber in lochs, and from old buildings. Our work was concentrated in the 5 areas where you find living native pine wood today. And this is where the chronology development went on. So the dots are sites where we've sampled living trees, essentially, and subfossil material in lochs. The stars are the first few historical sites we did, but there are many more now. We've sampled about 35 altogether. Most of the buildings work is concentrated either in the Cairngorms, around Bewley and Inverness, downstream from Glen Affric and Strathglass, which is another big native pine area. And we've touched on Perthshire a little bit, and a little bit in the West Highlands at Edeloch. But really, we've mostly been in the northeast. And there's plenty of opportunity to roll this out into other parts of Scotland. We haven't studied everything. There's some of my colleagues doing what they like to do best, puddling about in the water, looking for subfossil trees to sample. And here they are at some fine weather at the Green Loch at Glenmore, pulling some old timber from the loch and taking a sample from it to add to our collection of subfossil tree samples. And this was a really important site, not least because the trees which fell into that loch came from that scree slope above, and they were really slow grown and very, very old. So they helped provide some big building blocks for chronology development. So that's part of the haul of samples from the lochs. We have over 1,000 trees sampled now. Just a quick mention of methodology. We've used 2 methods really. The traditional method of measuring ring width, which is what most dendrochronology is based on, especially for dating. But we've also been measuring density. The density of the wood depends on the lignin formation in the cells. And within one annual ring, the cells start off big and end up small and compact with thicker walls. And so the density increases from the early wood to the late wood in every ring. The density of the late wood is very much controlled by climate. It's controlled by summer temperatures, which is great because it really helps us to reconstruct summer temperatures in the past. But measuring density is a very expensive and laborious process. Fortunately, there are some other properties we can use, and that is the intensity of reflected blue light, which reduces as you get into the late wood. And so we can measure the amount of blue light being reflected to get a proxy measure of density, which in turn is a proxy measure of summer temperatures. So that we call that the blue intensity method, and that's a hell of a lot quicker and cheaper than doing density work with a densitometer. So we've used this software called Co-Recorder, which allows you to scan a prepared sample, and you can then measure the ring width on the scan but you can also measure the blue intensity on the scan. And the other benefit is you get a permanent record of your measurements. And so if you find any problems, you can go back to your measurements and check them. And we've brought out a recent paper on this method, the application in dendrodating. So we've used pine samples from old trees, from buildings, as I said, and we've analysed about 33 buildings and 2 archaeological sites. The majority of them are close to the native pinewood areas, and so far we've managed to date 20 sites. That's 19 buildings and 1 archaeological site. Before I show you some of the sites we've dated, I just wanted to show you this diagram, the top part of this diagram actually, that shows the replication we've achieved over the last 2,000 years. This area here is where the living tree data comes in the last 200 to 300 years. And these data are from the Cairngorms and from Glen Affric. Then in the light green, that's the subfossil material, that's the record back into the medieval period. Again, from the Cairngorms and Glen Affric. The blue is Glen Affric. The historical data is this sort of browny red colour, so you can see how much data we've contributed from buildings and the like. It's quite slight here, but there's a significant amount of data come from buildings in the medieval period. Now to talk you through some of the buildings we've dated, I'm doing this in reverse chronological order, so starting with the most recent. We've got a cluster of mid-19th century buildings, and I'm not going to go into them all in any detail, but one of them, the dismantled one from Granton-on-Spey, that's in that store there, that was when it was stored at the museum in Granton-on-Spey, that had been archaeologically recorded and dismantled by Guard way back in the 90s, I think, and we've managed to date that building amongst these others. You can see the sorts of buildings that are quite typical of the Highlands in the 19th century. This is quite an interesting group, going back a little bit in time. These are all pine cruck frames called composite crucks, and composite crucks are where the cruck is not one piece of wood, but is made of 2 jointed pieces of wood. So you've got a post, an upright post, and then another piece coming off at an angle. These have all dated to the very early 19th century, really within just a handful of years of each other, and they're representatives of the new settlement order after the clearances and after the improvement era and so on. This was a rather nice collection. The Highland Folk Museum have actually got a lot of timbers in storage under their joiner's workshop, which is a brilliant place to visit if you're into wood. So we've sampled quite a few timbers from their collection and managed to date the best 3. And actually you can see that there's some really long sequences in amongst them, especially the one from an unknown building. That's really slow-grown, long-lived pine, quite unusual for this period. And Bob Powell, who was the director of the Highland Folk Museum, said that Highland people knew the value of slow-grown hill pine, as he called it, because it was very resinous, and therefore it lasted longer. It's much more durable than the fast-grown stuff, which we see more commonly in the buildings. Here's a little cluster of buildings in the mid-18th century, and you can see there are a few dates there that are just after the 45, and some of these buildings were probably burned during the turbulence of the 45 and the uprising. And Alagi, for example, was a Jacobite family's house, and is really near Corgarth Castle, which was then occupied by the Hanoverian army in 1746. So possibly the house was burned down and then rebuilt shortly after that period. Storehouse, the Folis, is the same. The real surprise, though, in this little group is the Dune at Rothiemurchus. That's the mansion house at Rothiemurchus Estate. Well, Rothiemurchus is one of the principal native pine areas, has a lot of its own timber, but when they were building this extension to the dune, we've discovered that they used Scandinavian timber. And that was for some very massive joists, which were really long and really big, and had a lot of rings in them, actually. And there is a historical context for this find. That is that some timber merchants had actually bought the rights to fell Rothiemurchus around this time, to fell a lot of timber there. They had a contract for 40,000 trees, but they were soon complaining they couldn't even find 500 trees that were bigger than 10 inches square. And they were complaining that the wood was too young and too small to cut with profit. So we're looking at a woodland that had already been heavily exploited by the mid-18th century, and this is why the owners at Doon had to buy in some timber. It's a small group of buildings from before the 45, and I think this one's quite interesting. Killy Huntley doesn't look too spectacular, but actually that's quite a large cruck frame, and that came in with the earliest date we've got so far for a cruck at 1730. Wardlaw Mausoleum's fantastic. This beautiful little building is the burial aisle of the Lovat Frasers, and it was built in the 17th century, but remodelled in the early 18th century. And the roof timbers were really young. They only had about 15 to 30 rings, which isn't enough for Dendro. But the hatch to the crypt, to the burial crypt, had amazing long-lived boards in it. And we got some really long sequences from them. And they dated to 1721. Well, the date on the belfry is 1722, so pretty pleased with that one. You can just see the lead coffins in the burial crypt there. And one of them is the coffin of Simon Lord Lovat, who became known as the Old Fox of the Jacobite rebellion, and he was the last man to be beheaded in Britain. And recently they got permission to look inside his coffin, and there is indeed a headless skeleton in there, so that's quite good fun. Now, there's a bit of a gap in the 17th century. Apart from one sarking board from Fowlis Castle, we've got no felling dates in the 17th century from buildings. I don't know yet whether that's a real gap, or whether it's an accident of random sampling, but it was also difficult to extend the living tree data back before 1700. So there may be something going on with woodland dynamics at this time that mean we haven't got much material. Got a lovely collection of late medieval pine structures, including a magnificent roof at Mingus Castle in Perthshire. It's just wonderful. That's dated to 1572, which fits in really well with historical evidence for the building. Our one archaeological site dated is Edinburgh, which is in Loch Traig. That was excavated in the 1930s, and the timbers, fortunately, were kept at Fort William Museum since then. And 4 of the pine from Edinburgh have now been dated. And that date of 1550 ties in really nicely with the artefactual evidence for 16th century use. So that's pretty good. And then Castle Grant has Castle Grant has a relict roof. Underneath an 18th century roof, there's a part of a 16th century roof in one part of the castle. And that's now been dated to sometime after 1512. I should say TPQ stands for Terminus Post Quem, date after which the timber was felled. Sorry, I should have said that earlier. Now, you'd expect our earliest stuff to come from the Highlands, but it doesn't. The earliest assemblage we found is actually from St Andrews, in a building called St John's House, which belongs to the university, and was refurbished in the early 1990s when Edwina Proudfoot had an office there. And she, very wonderfully, she made sure that we got a chance to take samples from these timbers before they were got rid of, basically. And they've proved to be the most important assemblage of all of the historic pine. They're really long-lived, they're really slow-grown, and they're the earliest group felled in the mid-15th century. That was very probably a 15th century ceiling that they came out of, where they were accompanied by some recycled 13th century oak roof timbers. Not everything's been a huge success. There have been some sites we just couldn't date, and this is a list of them. I won't go through them in any detail, but the one amongst them that galls me the most is Corrimony Grange Barn, which is an absolutely fantastic building, a huge cruck frame in Glen Urquhart. We took quite a few samples from there, and they had a decent number of rings, but the wood was very heavily wormed, a lot of woodworm in it, and getting intact samples out was just really difficult. So sample fragmentation is the reason we haven't managed to date that yet, but I think we should go back and try and take some more. So we've dated 20 sites out of our 35 so far. They range between the 15th and the 19th century. Only 8 of them could be regarded as vernacular buildings, and they're all from the 18th and 19th centuries. We've learned a lot about what type of samples we should go for to get the best success rates. And really, we should aim for sites where we can get at least 6 samples from the same phase, if not more, and an absolute bottom line of 60 rings, but preferably a lot more. And as you saw from the previous slide, the undated sites all have issues regarding sample numbers, age, or condition. Oh, sorry. Yeah, I just wanted to point out that we've come across what you probably would expect to find in the earliest period, some very slow-grown, long-lived pine from relatively undisturbed woodlands, possibly in marginal places like really high on north-facing slopes or in boggy ground or what have you. But interestingly enough, some of the medieval sites have really young timber, just, 40 or 50 years old and fast grown, like this Joyster Abertarf house in Inverness. We didn't sample it because it had so few rings, but it must be 16th century. And this probably indicates that many of the pine woodlands were already impacted by human intervention by the late medieval period, even though traditionally it's been the view that they weren't very well known outside of the Highlands until well after 1600. So it looks to me like they were really being used quite heavily on the whole. We've also uncovered some evidence of long-distance transport in the medieval period, because that material at St John's House must have come down one of the rivers, possibly the Spey, or maybe the Dee, and then round the coast down to St Andrews down here. Similarly, we're still studying a set of boards from Shuttle Street at the Franciscan Friary in Glasgow, and they must be pre-Reformation. They're very, very slow-grown pine as well. We haven't actually pinned down their dating or provenance yet, but if they're native, they came from one of the southerly pine woods probably, and down Loch Lomond quite possibly. So a quick few words about impacts and management. We've seen that medieval use was mostly local, as in Castle Mingus and Castle Grant, but there was some long-distance transport going on as well, for example, at St Andrews. We see that the exploitation of the woods was already happening in the medieval period, but escalated through the 17th and 18th centuries and peaked around the sort of Napoleonic Wars era. We know that sawmills were established in Scotland from the 17th century, and they were primarily used for making boards rather than for beams. We know that in general, or we see that in general, the western pine woods were more heavily exploited, and the eastern pine woods regenerated better in their drier conditions. We probably have evidence in our buildings of selective felling going on well before 1770, and there are documented examples of those sorts of cutting contracts as well. And the better contracts required the timber merchants to leave the young trees and to also leave some seed source trees so that there was a means of regeneration in the woodland. We do see some clear fell examples, but they become more common afterwards, later. The preponderance of lots of young wood in the buildings, that's timber with very few rings, makes you wonder about how long plantations have been with us. And from our evidence, we would say that from at least 1700, there's probably a lot of plantation wood in our historic buildings, including in the Highlands. Right, this is the last little bit of the talk. This is the work of my dendroclimate colleagues. This is their reconstruction of summer temperatures for the last 800 years for the Highlands of Scotland, effectively. And is calibrated against instrument readings, historic instrument readings for this period. So the blue are cold, the red peaks are warmer periods. And just to pick out a couple of interesting things, this is the coldest reconstructed year, 1782, which is already known historically as the Black Year. That was a year of famine in Scotland. And so we picked up that really awful year there. The coldest decade was from 1695, and this followed on from the Hekla eruption in 1693. It's also the time of the Maunder minimum, which is when the sunspot activity was reduced. And these years became known as the 7 ill years, and lots of people in Scotland died of famine in that period. It was a pretty awful time to be living in Scotland. So in summary, the SCOT2K project has delivered pretty much what we hoped. We now know that the dating of native pine, which was very difficult before, is now possible because we've built these long native pine chronologies against which we can date our sites. We've developed the blue intensity method alongside ring width, which is enabling us to date more of the buildings. And we have got a better understanding of our sample requirements for future work. We've got this wonderful reconstructed climate record for the last 800 years, and if anybody's interested to have a copy of that, please email me and I'll send you a link for that. And we've got these insights into the native pine wood use over the last several hundred years. So that's it. Thank you.